here today to have such an incredible introduction from my dear friend Dinah Becton, who herself has been a trailblazer and for whose leadership I try to emulate. It is also especially a privilege to be here today at this inaugural forum here at Berkeley with your new executive director, and to be reunited with many of my friends. Cheza and I have had the opportunity to see each other 3 days in a row in Chicago and now here. And it is truly an honor and a privilege to be here with you as you launch this initiative. And to Christine and the folks at Prosecutors Alliance, we go back many years as well. When I was starting my career as an elected prosecutor and trying to find what is the footing in order to do the work that we do and has been done for many years, but to put a lens of equity and justice and fairness and, as Christine said, love at the center of what we do. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to know me, I am Kim Foxx. I've been the elected prosecutor in Chicago, Cook County since 2016. What you should know is it was a historic election. I was the first Black person elected to this position, the first Black woman to serve in this role. That when I ran in 2016, it was and will feel eerily familiar to 2020 or 1992 or 1968. In 2016, when I ran for office, began running in 2015, there had been a murder of a 17-year-old boy named Laquan McDonald. Laquan, who had touched the criminal justice system as well as our child welfare system since his early days in this world. He'd been a foster child. He had gone in and out of foster homes. Laquan had issues around his mental health. And on this fateful night in October of 2014, as he was walking down a Chicago city street armed with a small blade, having a mental health episode, Chicago police were called out to investigate. A car rolled up and they followed Laquan as he walked, swinging his arm, and they just followed. Laquan walked for several blocks, and suddenly there were more police presence on the scene. A car drove up, a door opened, and within 4 seconds, Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke jumped out of his car and pumped 16 bullets into Laquan McDonald's body. 16 shots. The first of the 8 shots, Laquan had fallen to the ground, and as he lay on the ground, the additional shots pumped his body. The video would demonstrate that Laquan's body was jerking on the ground as that officer's hands were there and the others were standing aside. The video that was filmed that night in October of 2014 would not be released until almost a year later. An election happened. There was a lot of noise around the mayoral election and what was the role of the video not being released. There were legal challenges, as we are wont to do as lawyers. Do we have to release this video? Should we release this video? A lot of our calculations in how we do this work is we can, but should we? We don't have to, but should we? And I mention this because the video, Laquan's horrific murder, is part of how I got here. The video was held past the mayoral election. There was dogged journalism that knew that this video existed. There were murmurs among the Chicago Police Department and folks in law enforcement that there was this horribly shocking, horrific video of the death of a 17-year-old. And there were challenges in court around transparency to see what happened to this boy. Ultimately, after many legal challenges, the video was released 1 week before Thanksgiving in 2015. I should also note that this murder happened, and I call it a murder. We'll get to how it ultimately played out. In October of 2014, 13 months had passed from the death of this child to when the world got to see what happened. 13 months. 13 months, and the release of the video, I should also tell you, was not some altruistic notion. A judge, doing what we do in our courts of law, ruled that the video had to be released, and the video was released. And everyone got to see what is, in essence, a snuff film. And I was still running When I ran for office, I should tell you, I didn't run because of the murder of Laquan McDonald. I'd started my campaign wanting and dealing with the issues of criminal justice in Cook County, again, the second largest jurisdiction in the country, a jurisdiction that had a long and storied history of a criminal justice system that had treated Black and brown communities unfairly. A criminal justice system so ripe with mistrust in law enforcement that we had a police commander, Commander Burge, who ultimately went to prison, not for what I'm going to describe to you he did, and all of this ties together in terms of why we do this work. Commander Burge went to prison for lying about torturing people to elicit confessions. He didn't go to prison for torturing people. In fact, there was a finding that Commander Burge and his midnight crew who worked on the south side of Chicago, large Black population, in the 80s and early 90s, in order to elicit confessions from people in our community, did things like place electrodes on their testicles and shock them, slap them in faces with phone books. His crimes, again, largely against defendants who were accused of heinous crimes, went unpunished. People were convicted for murders of police officers, based on tainted evidence. The then state's attorney would have to review these cases. And in retrospect, when we look and we see the documents and the pictures of the defendants who were coming in with bloodied eyes and burned bodies and saying, this happened to me, and the prosecutors said, we have to weigh whether we're gonna get this conviction or whether we believe someone who has caused harm. We ended the death penalty in the early aughts in Illinois because of what happened with John Burge. I mentioned that to juxtapose what was happening in 2015 when I decided to run, and to juxtapose what happens to a community that knew a person like John Burge, who was committing these heinous acts, had existed for over 2 decades. And now Laquan. And now Laquan. What I'm trying to explain to you is that these things don't happen in isolation. There's not just this case in this moment in those communities that have many examples beyond what I'm describing to you. It is embedded in their collective memories. It is cumulative to them. It is the neighborhoods, like the neighborhoods that John Burge and his midnight crew run roughshod over, that when violence happens, they're less likely to pick up the phone and call the police. They're neighborhoods, like the neighborhoods that Laquan McDonald grew up in, where we see incidents of violence happening, and where we see high levels of violence and low confidence in law enforcement. It is these neighborhoods, the narratives around who cares about their communities start to generate. That in Chicago, my hometown, and I would be one if I've never done a speech without telling you where in Chicago I come from. I'm from Cabrini Green. And for those of you who are older in this room and don't remember it just from things like Candyman, it was one of the most notorious public housing projects in the United States. I lived there in the 70s and early 80s when we had homicide rates in the city of Chicago hovering around 950 people per year. I mention that because even then, in the 70s and 80s, when I were growing up, when there were memories of what was happening with law enforcement in the 60s, when things popped off in Cabrini, the rationale that was being made about what to do was whether or not they picked up the phone and called police, but they didn't know who was going to come. What officer would come? Because they had not seen police officers be held accountable for the mistreatment of people who lived in neighborhoods and communities like the ones that they lived in. A cumulative effect. High incidence of violence, low confidence in law enforcement. The common denominator is a lack of accountability. There had become an expectation that there would be no accountability. And when that accountability doesn't exist, the credibility and the legitimacy of our systems fail. This is a public safety issue. The illegitimacy and the lack of credibility in law enforcement drives violence in our communities. I dare you to find neighborhoods that have high incidence of violence, the same high level of confidence in law enforcement. The neighborhoods that have been long entrenched in these issues with violence also have long entanglements with law enforcement and history. I should tell you, it's not, I often get frustrated because there's this narrative about community and law enforcement. And there's a gulf. Like, we have all the buzzwords. We know the buzzwords. So there's a gulf between law enforcement and community. We've got to bridge the gulf. One, we have to acknowledge why the gulf exists. People who live in neighborhoods like the one I grew up in want to be safe. They want their children to go outside and jump rope, to play basketball. They want to be able to have their elders go and garden without fear of being harmed. They have the same wants and needs as every other community. The Gulf, John Burge, Jason Van Dyke, Reynaldo Guevara, Ronald Watts. These are names that may be unfamiliar to you when Dinah talks about the hundreds of convictions that we have vacated. These are the names of the officers that we have vacated convictions from. Ronald Watts went to prison for shaking down drug dealers in the Ida B. Wells public housing projects, long before I got there. Planting guns and drugs on people who wouldn't cooperate with him. For those of you who have seen the movie Training Day, Denzel is modeled after Ronald Watts. What's amazing is Ronald Watts has not gone or been held accountable for the planting of the drugs and the guns and the hundreds of people for whom we vacated those convictions. He didn't go to jail for that. Detective Reynaldo Guevara, who has been found in our courts to be incredible. Anything that this man says is no longer credible, who was a homicide detective in the Humboldt Park neighborhood, a largely Latino neighborhood in the 80s and 90s. He cannot come into a court of law in Cook County and put his hand on the Bible and be found credible anywhere. He has been brought into a deposition room and has pled the fifth over and over and over again. So what happens to people who live in Humboldt Park who know that a Detective Guevara, and that's just him. When things happen in that neighborhood, they don't know if they're getting a Detective Guevara. The people in Ida B. Wells, I don't know if I'm getting Ronald Watts. When we don't hold law enforcement accountable, we then have to rely on newfangled technology like ShotSpotter. We thought about it for a minute, law enforcement friends. I was at Stanford a couple weeks ago, and in Palo Alto, and it's like all ideas and innovations of like, what is the new creativity that we can come up with to solve for our problems? And it dawned on me while I was at Stanford that they created a technology like ShotSpotter to be able to detect gunshots. Because in certain neighborhoods, I'll tell you where ShotSpotter is in Chicago. It's in these neighborhoods I just described to you. That they needed to create a technology because people were so lacking in trust to call the police when shots were being fired, we had to create a system to hear the shots. That is a credibility and legitimacy problem. And that credibility and legitimacy problem happens when we do not do the right thing and hold those who cause harm accountable. The credibility and legitimacy problem happens when we decide and make calculations around our own risk. What happens if I pursue this case as a prosecutor? What happens to me? Well, I'll tell you what happens. I won my election in 2016 on the strength of a movement of activists and advocates in a city that said they had had enough. They'd seen that video. They knew that the former prosecutor knew what was on that video and didn't charge. By the way, she charged days after the video was released. Too little, too late. I should tell you that Jason Van Dyke was found guilty of killing Laquan McDonald. And in what is a stunning thing to all of us who do this work, only received a 6-year sentence for pumping 16 bullets into a 17-year-old child. But what happened with that election, I won. by a staggering amount. And that was not because I was somehow that much more stellar. It was a mandate. It was a mandate from the people of Chicago that they, or Cook County, they wanted something different. They wanted accountability. They wanted it. And I ran saying that they would get it. And so I promised, and I have, charged law enforcement officers when they have gone afoul of their badge, when they've discredited the work that they were sworn to do. And in doing so, I've drawn the ire of the Fraternal Order of Police. I've drawn the ire of those who do this work and who accountability is such a foreign notion to them. That the notion that we have to say that, hey, if you do wrong, it doesn't mean that we don't appreciate law enforcement. There became this narrative. When I said police accountability meant she doesn't like law enforcement. That's wild. That is wild. That in no other profession, that if we say to people, if you work in a kitchen and you've got to wash your hands because data and research shows that you will make people sick if you don't clean your hands, and everyone will agree, you should wash your hands, and if you don't, we should do something about it. But if you pump 16 bullets into a child who is not posing any harm, it is not antithetical to our mission to hold law enforcement accountable. And when we don't, those communities that need us most trust us least. So I did it. I have charged many cases of law enforcement officers shooting unarmed citizens. And I would like to tell you that we have been successful. I'm going to end with our failures. We keep losing and losing and losing. Just a month ago, I'm looking at Lynn McCarthy, who runs our Law Enforcement Accountability Division, who's here with us today. We lost the case on video. 2 young men dressed in hoodies, hanging outside. See a car pull up, unmarked squad car with traffic officers. Officer sees them, he raises his hand to show him, because we don't know, the unmarked car, not wearing a uniform, I don't know who you are, you don't know who I am, just in case we're on the wrong, let me raise my hand. An officer leans through the window past his partner's nose and shoots him on video. Falls, kid who was with him turns, sees, because now we don't know if this is a gang shooting or not, shoots back. What's crazy about this story is that the officers who did this, when they brought the case to us, they didn't bring it, oh, we shot somebody. They said that they were shot at first. And there's a video that says otherwise. We lost. Our record on these cases, on duty, I think 0-5, 0-5. All of them before a judge, never a jury. So it doesn't mean that my lawyers aren't some of the best and brightest, most brilliant lawyers in this country. They are, in fact, the best, brightest, most brilliant. What it means is that we have a system, that accountability is fleeting. What inspires me, though, that even in the wake of our last loss, is that the community, and even the media, were like, yo, yo, what gives? In loss number 4, the community and the media, yo, what gives? That there has now been, this isn't anomalous, us filing these charges. This isn't some earth-shattering thing when we bring charges against law enforcement. That it is now not Kim Foxx and some rogue brigade to try to undermine law enforcement. It is now expected. It is expected. Win or lose, you do the work. The calculation could never be, and should never be, I don't want to draw the ire of the FOP. I don't want to draw the ire of our law enforcement partners. I don't want to draw the ire of what it looks like. I don't want to lose. If the evidence is sufficient, and you have a credible reason to believe that you can win or try this case, try it. Try it. Try it with the same fierce level of urgency that you would try a case involving someone who is not a law enforcement officer. Try it knowing that it is the mandate for public safety that the communities that are watching you and your accountability, who have to trust you, are counting on it. Try it. Try it if you're 0-5 or 0-9. Try it if it's your first one, when the evidence suggests that you do. Because I will tell you that the hardest part of the last 7 years in a county like Cook, and I love that Dinah says when people say Kim Foxx, well, oh, some rooms like, and you have been in those rooms. And you're like, this broad, okay. The challenge has been battling that. And the biggest source of controversy for me in those rooms have been this perception that we have gone against the grain. The grain is no longer sufficient. The cumulative effect of the lack of accountability and police misconduct has been destabilizing to the communities that need us the most. There is no shot spotter for prosecutors. There will not be an AI technology to be able to do our jobs because we have lost such level of credibility by not doing our jobs. It requires a level of bravery and a reminder of the commitment. It shouldn't have to be families bearing their souls and living in their purpose after tremendous loss to inspire us to do what we do. I sat with those family members last night, and their courage in their loss to get up and do the work that they do should serve as a reminder to you that you took an oath to do this. You will come under fire. It will be difficult. But on behalf of those who are counting on you in those neighborhoods who need you the most, it is absolutely worth it. Thank you very much.